The wind tore through the dry pine branches, carrying with it the damp scent of snow and the faint ashes of a long-gone winter. Along the trail leading into the no-hunting zone, Jonas Hale tightened the collar of his coat. His rubber boots pressed quiet imprints into the hardened earth. He had lived alone in the wooden cabin for 7 years, since the day his daughter, Ellie, died in a storm that swept across the Appalachian Mountains. Back then, he was still the head forest ranger. It was he who gave the order to open the rescue route, but too late. Since then, he had left everything behind: the job, familiar faces, and even his faith in anything greater than himself. That morning, while on a routine patrol, the ranger station radio repeated a piece of news that no one seemed to care about. A pedigree dog trafficking ring has just been dismantled near the border. Evidence suggests they may have abandoned several makeshift camps in the forest. Jonas didn't care about those people, but something stirred within him, like an echo from deep inside his memory. He took a flashlight, his old weapon, and headed straight for the northern edge of the preserve, where an old, long-abandoned camp once stood. The breeding camp was still there, rotting, desolate, torn canvas tents, rotting wooden fences, and a few rusted chains still swinging in the wind. Jonas slowed his steps, alert, and then, he heard it. Not a bark, but a sound of breathing. Labored, heavy, almost choking. He shone his light and saw a German shepherd, her body covered in dust and dirt, once golden fur now matted and grimy beyond recognition, lay on her side amid a pile of broken wood. One of her legs was injured, with dried blood crusted on her shoulder. Pressed against her belly was a tiny pup, eyes still unopened. Jonas froze. The mother dog looked at him, not whining, not growling, not moving. Those dark eyes didn't plead, they simply waited, as if she had seen too much, endured too much, and now had just enough strength left to accept it all. What broke Jonas was her silence. Not a whimper, not a sound came from her throat. When he stepped closer, she strained to shield her pup, mouth opening in a silent snarl, but nothing came out. Jonas knelt, gently reaching for the chain still wrapped around her neck, and saw the flesh beneath had been torn into scars. It must have been there for far too long. He whispered, "Who did this to you?" The wind passed through, dragging with it the dry, rattling sound of old chains. Jonas looked around. No one, nothing, no trace of life, except for her and her little one. He quietly unfastened the chain, wrapped the decaying blanket around the mother and her pup, and lifted them, without hesitation, without a word. The wooden cabin that once held only silence, guilt, and fractured memories was now, once again, home to something living. The wooden door creaked as Jonas pushed it open. His cabin smelled of damp and mildew. It had been a long time since the last fire. Still, there were enough blankets, cushions, and necessities to sustain life, even if only barely. He gently laid the mother dog on the old mattress near the fireplace and lit a fire. She remained still, eyes fixed on him, but there was no more resistance. Jonas was no stranger to injured animals. Before becoming a ranger, he had worked part-time as a veterinarian. He knew what needed to be done. Yet this time, his hands trembled slightly as he cleaned her wounds. Not just because of her frailty, but because of the silence, so complete it pierced the air. No whimpers, no flinching, not a trace of pain on her face. Only her eyes, deep and dark like the sky before a storm. The wound on her neck was the most severe. Jonas carefully trimmed away the fur matted with dried blood. For the first time, he saw it clearly. A thin gash had closed on the surface. But beneath it, the tissue was badly damaged. What had been used? A noose? A blade? Some kind of tool? Jonas shook his head gently. He didn't want to know. The tiny pup, so small its eyes were still shut, kept pressing against its mother's belly. Seeking warmth, Jonas placed a small heating lamp nearby, then went to prepare warm milk using an old feeding syringe he had once used during a mountain rescue long ago. Drink, little one, he whispered, easing a drop of milk into the puppy's mouth. You've got a whole life ahead of you. And then, something strange happened. The mother dog, still voiceless, let something flicker through her eyes as Jonas fed her baby. It wasn't fear, nor was it instinctive protection. It was recognition, as if, for the first time in a long stretch of exhaustion, she understood that someone meant her no harm. Jonas sat down beside them, poured himself a cup of warm water, and watched the two. The cabin began to feel alive again, not because of sound, but because of presence. He looked at her and said softly, I lost a child, too, Ellie. She was 8, loved dogs. If she were still here, she would have given you a name the second you stepped through that door. She didn't understand the words, but her gaze never left him. Jonas looked down at the wooden floor, his voice low and rough. Maybe this is the first time I've spoken to anyone since that day. The fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the walls. A man carrying a silent grief, and a dog who had forgotten how to bark. 2 broken souls, sitting side by side, needing no words. The next morning began with a sliver of sunlight slipping through the mist-covered window pane. Inside the small wooden cabin, the fire in the stove still burned faintly, just enough to keep the fragile threads of life from unraveling. Jonas woke in the old armchair, a thin blanket draped across his shoulders. He hadn't slept deeply, he hadn't in years. But the moment his eyes opened, he turned immediately toward the corner of the room. She was still there. The mother dog curled protectively around her pup like a silent embrace. Her eyes opened slightly when Jonas stirred, but there was no panic now, only wariness, just enough to survive. He sat up, quietly added more wood to the fire, then walked over and knelt beside the mattress, as if stepping into some sacred ground. I don't know what you've been through, he whispered, but if you're going to stay, you need a name. He looked into her eyes, black like polished obsidian, deep and unreadable, and quietly said, Kaia, you look like a girl named Kaia. She didn't understand the word, but when it was spoken, it felt like something shifted in the air, as if this cabin, once just a shelter, now had someone who could be called a person. Kaia, no longer just an animal, no longer it, but a name, a presence. Jonas walked to the kitchen shelf and opened an old tin box where he kept emergency supplies. Inside were a few packets of dry dog food he had kept, just in case. He had once told himself, in case I ever come across a wounded animal. He softened the food in warm water, placed it in a ceramic bowl, and set it down near Kaia. She glanced at it, then slowly stepped forward, still limping on her back leg. She sniffed, then began to eat, not desperately, not fearfully, slowly, and just enough to make Jonas's heart loosen a little. So, you're not planning on running off, he said, half joking, half trying to reassure himself. The tiny pup, still blind, began to make faint mewling sounds, its little limbs twitching as it instinctively sought its mother. Jonas watched, and in that strange moment, he realized his home, once just a prison of memories, was now filled with the sounds of the living. As night fell, Jonas sat at the wooden table and wrote a few lines in an old journal he had long forgotten in a drawer. It had been years since he wrote anything unrelated to weather patterns or patrol routes. March 7th, found a German shepherd and her pup at the abandoned camp. The mother is injured, voiceless, named her Kaia. She looks like she's seen something no creature should have to witness. But she didn't give up. I think, neither did I. When he closed the journal, Jonas looked toward the mattress, where Kaia lay, eyes shut, her body wrapped around her pup like a vow. No barking, no need. Jonas sighed. Maybe there was nothing more to say. Maybe silence was the one thing they both understood best. 3 days passed. The wooden cabin deep in the forest, once a place of absolute silence, was now slowly taking on a new rhythm. The sound of milk dripping into a puppy's mouth, the soft crackling of firewood, and the slow, deliberate steps of Kaia as she moved through the room, checking her makeshift nest. Jonas woke early, as he always did, and went to inspect the forest fence, an old habit from his days as a ranger that he'd never let go. But this morning, he stopped short. Footprints, not his, not an animal, but deep, heavy boot prints pressed into the thin layer of snow behind the cabin, a place no one ever walked. And they were fresh. Jonas crouched down, fingers brushing the edge of the print. Still cold. Whoever made them had been here just a few hours ago. He turned back inside, his face calm, but his eyes now carried a deeper line of thought. After breakfast, Jonas pulled out an old radio frequency tracker he used to use with his ranger gear. A memory had stirred. On Kaia's neck wound, there was an oddly hard, swollen area, like something had been implanted there. Not a standard pet microchip. Something bigger. He gently carried Kaia to the light by the window. She resisted slightly, not in fear, but as if she knew he was about to touch a place that hurt. "Easy now, just a look," he murmured, as he pressed gently through the fur around the scar. His fingers found a small, smooth lump, plastic. He turned on the device and scanned across the frequency band. There it was, a signal. It was transmitting, a GPS tracker. Jonas clenched his jaw, his heart beat slow and heavy, like a hammer made of lead. Someone had implanted a tracking device into Kaia, which meant someone was still looking for her, and the footprints behind the house might not have been a coincidence. They might have been a message. He yanked the power cord from the transmitter. The signal disappeared. Then he gathered his medical tools and a pair of scissors. There was no other choice. He had to remove it. The longer it stayed, the more danger she was in. Kaia lay still, shivering only slightly as he made the first cut through the skin near the embedded device. She didn't flinch, didn't fight. Her eyes held pain, but not blame, as if she knew this had to be done. When Jonas pulled the tracker out, he placed it into a sealed glass jar and screwed the lid tight. "If they come back," he whispered, "at least, you're no longer a signal waiting to be hunted." Kaia licked his hand, a small, gentle gesture, but in it was recognition. Jonas collapsed into the chair, wiping his brow. Outside, the forest was still, but he knew that stillness had changed. Someone was looking for Kaia, not to rescue her, but to silence her, and for the first time in years, something stirred inside Jonas, not fear, but something deeper. Responsibility. It wasn't just about saving a creature anymore. It was about making sure a truth didn't get buried again. That night, the wind fell into an eerie stillness. No owls, no rustling trees, only the low, groaning hum of the fireplace, like the aged breath of the earth itself. Buried under cold soil, Jonas sat by the window, hunting rifle resting across his lap. Kaia lay ahead, eyes fixed on the forest, though her body showed the strain from that morning's procedure. The tiny pup slept curled on a double blanket, a small world, fragile and surviving, tucked into the heart of a wilderness that loomed like a threat. At the stroke of midnight, the motion sensor light Jonas had once installed for tracking wildlife blinked 3 times at the edge of the trees. Not the wind, not deer, something intentional. Jonas sprang to his feet and grabbed the infrared binoculars. On the green-tinted screen appeared a figure, moving silently, tall, broad-shouldered, leather jacket, hooded. He didn't sneak, didn't hesitate. He was walking directly toward the cabin. Jonas turned to Kaia. She was already on her feet, though one leg still trembled. Her face held no fear, only memory, recognition. The past had come alive in her eyes. "It's him," Jonas whispered. "You know him, don't you?" Kaia let out a raspy, guttural sound. Her throat had no voice left, but what rose from her was fierce. She stood guard at the door, body trembling, eyes locked on the woods. Jonas didn't ask more. He pulled the curtain shut, bolted the door, and turned off the lights. The man's footsteps stopped just beyond the porch. Then, a voice rang out, not loud, but every word clear. "Old man, I'm here for the dog. Give her back, and no one gets hurt." Jonas answered with silence. "She's not your dog." The voice pressed on, now edged with anger. "She's my property. You have no idea what kind of work she's part of." Kaia growled again, a dry rasp from a throat long stripped of sound. Jonas pressed his back to the wall, raised his rifle. He didn't yell, only spoke softly, just loud enough for the words to settle beyond the door. "If you ever called a living being, chained by the neck and tracked with a chip, your property, then you're not a man anymore." Silence. Then, a dry laugh. "I gave you a chance, old man, but if you keep her, you'll vanish with her." Footsteps retreated, fading into the woods. Jonas remained still long after the forest swallowed the sound, not out of fear, but because now he understood something deeper. This wasn't just about a discarded dog. Kaia wasn't just wounded, she was living evidence, a breathing, silent witness to something brutal, and someone out there wanted that truth erased. As the first light of dawn slipped through the trees, Jonas still hadn't slept. He stepped out onto the porch, eyes scanning the tree line. No one, but he knew, the man would return. And next time, he wouldn't come to talk. Jonas looked back to see Kaia gently licking her pup's wounds, then turned back inside. His voice was low, but steady. "I once let someone leave this world without being able to save them. But this time, I won't let it happen again." Kaia lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Two survivors, no longer running, but standing ready. Dawn stretched out like a breath held too long through a suffocating night. The sky above the forest shifted slowly from gray to pale blue. But for Jonas, no light could truly push back the darkness inside. Not until he stood up and twisted shut the lid of the glass jar that held the GPS tracker he had removed from Kaia's neck. He knew, this battle couldn't be fought alone. For the first time in years of self-imposed exile, Jonas picked up the satellite phone. He dialed a number he had nearly forgotten, the one belonging to Mason Burke, the only colleague he had ever trusted after Ellie's death. The phone rang, then a hoarse voice answered. Surprised. "Jonas, that you? God, how long's it been?" Jonas didn't waste time. "I need you at Raven Hollow. Urgently. Bring a camera, recording gear, and your belief in fighting injustice." Mason paused. Then, as if knowing Jonas wouldn't call over anything small, he simply said, "I'm on my way." That morning, Jonas spent hours inspecting the cabin windows, sight lines, hiding spots, and escape routes. He was no longer a ranger. But the instincts hadn't died. They never had. He camouflaged cameras with dried brush, hid a few bear traps under the thin snow along likely approach paths. Not to kill, just to warn. Inside, Kaia remained quiet, but no longer collapsed like in the first days. She moved more, licked Jonas's hand gently each time he knelt to check her wounds. The puppy had started to open its eyes, two soft black dots. Wide and innocent, but alive. One overcast noon, Jonas climbed into the attic and opened a wooden box he hadn't touched since Ellie passed. Inside were her scribbled drawings, and among them, a folded piece of paper, a dog with big ears, clever eyes, and, written in a child's scrawl beneath it, "I want a friend like this. His name will be Echo. Because when I'm sad, he'll echo me." Jonas sat there in silence for a long time. Then he returned to the living room, looking at Kaia and the pup. "Kaia, the little one, he needs a name. Ellie once wanted a dog named Echo. I think you wouldn't mind if your pup carried that name." Kaia tilted her head, eyes softening, as if nodding in quiet approval. By dusk, Mason appeared on the trail, stocky as ever, with a beard that had grown wild, but his eyes still held the fire of belief. After a silent embrace, he dropped his pack. "What did you find?" Jonas handed him the glass jar. Told him everything. Kaia, the abandoned camp, the footprints, the man in the night. Mason listened without interruption, only nodding now and then. Then he pulled out a signal receiver and scanned the chip's frequency. Coordinates appeared. She'd been tracked for at least 3 weeks. The data was being sent to a server out of state. Mason exhaled hard. This isn't just some lunatic. Jonas, this is a network. And this dog, she's the evidence. Jonas nodded. His voice was steady and low. Then we make sure this evidence stays alive. No matter what it takes. Night fell. The cabin was fortified. Cameras armed. Sensor lights are installed around the porch. Jonas and Mason sat in the small kitchen. Cups of hot tea in hand. In a silence that felt like the breath before a coming storm. Kaia lay beside them, breathing evenly. Echo, the pup's new name, slept curled in his mother's warmth. Mason turned to Jonas. Why help her? After everything. Jonas stared into the fire. His voice barely more than a whisper. As if asking himself the same question. Because I once lost a child I couldn't save. And this time, I won't let that happen again. The sky above Raven Hollow was starless. Thick clouds swallowed all light, pouring a heavy darkness down over the forest. The wind came in long waves. Not violent, but enough to rattle the wire lines strung with warning bells around the cabin. Jonas stood in the attic, eyes fixed on the thermal monitor connected to the perimeter cameras. Downstairs, Mason did a final check of the flashlights and door locks. The small wooden cabin had become a fortress, not indestructible, but enough to say, someone here is willing to stand their ground. Kaia lay curled around Echo, her body wrapped tightly as if each breath she exhaled was being passed directly into the fragile little life she sheltered. She didn't bark, she couldn't. But her eyes were sharp as blades. Her ears twitched constantly. She knew. Jonas knew. They were coming. 11:42 p.m. The west sensor light blinked. Mason tapped his earpiece. Movement. Fast. Looks like 3 people. Jonas chambered around. Don't shoot unless we have to. We keep life. We don't take it. Mason nodded, though his eyes carried no illusions. Then, the footsteps. Soft, steady, but not the kind made by wildlife. Someone was crawling low, carefully, through the mulch outside the cabin. A faint click came from the back door, the one Jonas had left with a decoy latch. On purpose. Hold position. Jonas whispered into the mic. Wait for the signal. The sounds multiplied, now from 3 directions. These weren't amateurs. They knew how to move, how to divide, how to silence their approach. But they didn't know one thing. This place had once been a grieving father's home, and was now a mother dog's last stand. The bell strung on the eastern fence suddenly rang out. Kaia sprang to her feet, not growling, not barking, just surging toward the door like a silent storm. Echo, still asleep, rolled gently against the hearth. Jonas rushed forward, grabbed Kaia, bolted the door, and signaled for silence. Then, a voice, deep, cold, old man, still won't give her up. Huh? This time, I'm not alone. Jonas stepped toward the front door, opened the small metal grate. Across the clearing stood 3 figures. 2 of them held air rifles. The one in the middle, the same man as before, leather jacket. Bare hands, eyes full of disdain. Jonas called out, "You can take your gear back. The money, the paperwork, but you won't take a life. Not again." The man sneered. "Then you've chosen how to die." In that instant, one of the men to the right raised his rifle. But before he could fire, a sudden snap echoed through the trees. He stumbled backward, screaming. His leg caught in a bear trap. Mason shouted from the attic, "Consider that a warning." The central figure raised his hand, signaling retreat, not out of fear, to regroup, but before vanishing into the woods. He called out, "You can't protect her forever. Next time, we won't come as 3. Jonas locked the door, leaned back against the timber wall. Kaia remained where she was, eyes still locked on the darkness outside. Mason descended, resting a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "They'll be back." Jonas exhaled, slow and sure. "Then they'll see. This isn't a lonely cabin anymore." He crouched beside Kaia, gently stroked her head, a gesture she didn't flinch from for the first time. You have no voice. I have no words left. But we still have heart. Inside the fireplace, the flames kept burning. Outside, the sky was black as ink, but in between stood a cabin where life refused to surrender. The next morning, snow fell lightly like dust. Not thick, not threatening. Just enough to cover the dried blood stains on the trail leading to the cabin. Remnants of the night before. Mason took photographs of everything, each footprint, each drag mark, each bear trap not fully sprung. Jonas stood silently for a long while by the bushes where the intruder had fallen. Nobody. They had taken him, cleaned up, but the stain in the eyes of the forest wasn't so easily erased. No time, Mason said, eyes fixed on his camera screen. They'll be back, and this time, with a plan. Then so will we. Jonas nodded. Together, they loaded up the vehicle, carrying the GPS device removed from Kaia's neck, the glass jar of dried blood, surveillance photos from the night before, and most importantly, a video clip Mason had captured. Kaia curled around Echo, silent, her eyes thunderous with instinct. And the moment Jonas faced the shadowed man in the woods, the drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through rocky passes, wild forest, and abandoned ranger stations. Their destination, a federal wildlife preservation center, once where Jonas used to send reports back when he was still a ranger. They were met by Emily Tran, the lead field researcher, sharp eyes, steady demeanor, hair pulled into a practical tie. The kind of woman who didn't flinch at ugly truths. But when she saw Kaia step out of the vehicle, limping, fur unkempt, eyes no longer panicked but piercing, Emily froze. This dog, I saw her in a report from last month, she said, her tone shifting. One of 12 listed as missing from an illegal breeding compound in Pennsylvania. 11 were rescued. 1 disappeared. Jonas nodded. We found her, not on a list, but buried in rubble, barely alive. Emily examined the photos and the footage. When she saw the chip, her hands clenched. This is a depth tracking model, originally used in research, but in the black market. It's repurposed to monitor breeding cycles, even remotely control movement. Mason handed her the device logs. Emily scanned them, then exhaled deeply. They're not just trafficking dogs. They're training them, genetically manipulating, forcing litters, especially German Shepherds for their intelligence and reflexes. Some of these are sold to illegal logging operations in border zones. Jonas looked her in the eye, his voice low. I'm not letting Kaia go back to being anyone's property. Not after what she's survived. And I don't think she's the only one. Emily paused, then nodded. We need to expose this. But not to the media. We need evidence, names, camps, buyers, transactions. Mason added. And we need extraction. Jonas can't protect them both in that cabin anymore. The room went still. Then Emily said, there's a place, a rehabilitation farm for abused animals. Private, off-grid. We can take Kaia and Echo there. For now. Jonas looked down at Kaia. She lay quietly by his feet. Even surrounded by strangers, she didn't tremble. They can leave this place, Jonas said, eyes reddening. But only if I know this time. They won't be forgotten. Emily placed a firm hand on his shoulder. We won't let that happen. That night, for the first time in years, Jonas didn't sleep inside his cabin. He slept in the car, somewhere along the long, winding journey. Kaia in the back seat, Echo dozing softly in a flannel-lined basket. Mason sat beside him, eyes closed, smiling faintly as Kaia leaned forward and licked Jonas's wrist before curling back into herself. Not everyone gets a second chance, Jonas, Mason whispered, but you gave her one. And she just gave you one too. Jonas didn't reply, but inside him, something softened, like an echo from an old dream returning, now given shape in warm fur, pointed ears, and eyes like mirrors, reflecting both the most beautiful and the most broken parts of being human. A week later, spring began to breathe softly across the land. Ice melted in patches. Forest birds returned, one by one. But for Jonas, time was no longer measured in days or nights. It was measured by Kaia's steady breaths, by each time Echo lifted his head for milk, and by every step Mason and Emily took them closer to the truth. At the Wildlife Center, Kaia and Echo were placed in a special zone. No cages, no chains, just wooden fences and kind eyes. Kaia had started to rasp again, still no full bark, but her throat seemed to be healing. She moved more, even played gently with Echo, sometimes nipping his tail like a long-forgotten mother and child game. Meanwhile, Mason and Emily traced the signal path from the GPS tracker. One code led them to a breeder's shipment database in the Greenfield outskirts. Operated under a private company, Silver Valley Canine Breeders. On paper, it was a legal facility, specializing in working dogs for private industries and mining sites. But among the transaction records Mason uncovered, one name appeared repeatedly: Devin Slater. When that name was spoken in the room, Jonas shot to his feet. Slater, he repeated, his voice darkening. Emily looked at him. You know him? Jonas's hands clenched. His eyes drifted to the window, where Kaia lay in the sunlight, half asleep. Devin Slater volunteered at a ranger rescue post nearly a decade ago. He said, his voice heavy like ash. Smart, quiet, but he had a look, one I never forgot. The look of someone who doesn't see life as sacred, only as a tool. You filed a report? I did. Jonas nodded, but he hadn't done anything, just a look. And you can't convict someone for a look. Emily paused, then said, maybe now we can. She handed him the latest report. Photos from a hidden kennel discovered using a second GPS signal. That was where Kaia had been kept. And not just her. At least 34 dogs listed as missing over the past 3 years had passed through there. Mason opened his laptop and played a leaked video from Slater's facility. A long concrete kennel, dim light, chaos of barking, and in the corner, a German Shepherd was being dragged by a catch pole. Kaia, there was no sound, but Jonas could still hear it, somewhere inside his chest. Emily shut the screen. Her voice hardened. He'll be indicted. But to end this, we need a living witness. Kaia is that witness, and maybe, so are you. Jonas nodded, slowly, but with resolve. I stayed silent once. When Ellie died, I didn't speak up against those who delayed the rescue. I won't let another life get swallowed by silence again. The trial date was set. Kaia couldn't testify like a human. But her presence, the scars, the GPS data, the footage, and Mason's chain of records were enough to build a case. Jonas would be the key witness. His first time in court since Ellie's death. But this time, he wouldn't walk in alone. On the morning of the trial, Jonas stepped out of the preparation room. Kaia walked beside him. No leash. She walked because she chose to. Every gaze in the courtroom turned toward them. An older man with silver in his hair, eyes like deep stone, and a shepherd dog with a proud but silent gait, like she carried the stillness of the wilderness itself. When the judge asked, Mr. Hale, would you like to make a statement? Jonas stepped forward, Kaia by his side, and he spoke, a voice rough with age, and steady like mountain breath. I'm not here just for a dog. I'm here for every living soul that cannot voice their pain. I used to think silence was how you survive. But the truth is, silence is how people like Devin Slater survive. Today, I speak, for Ellie, for Kaia, and for every bark the world never heard. The courtroom fell silent. Then, one person clapped, then another, and then the whole room. Kaia remained still, her eyes fixed on Jonas. Echo slept curled in Emily's arms, as if the world had become, if only slightly, easier to breathe. The trial ended after 7 days of testimony. Devin Slater was convicted on multiple counts: animal cruelty, operating an illegal breeding facility, and obstruction of justice during a federal investigation. He didn't bow his head. But for the first time in all the years Jonas had known him, That gaze, the cold, unreadable stare, was gone, replaced by fear. Not fear of Jonas, not of Kaia, not even of the law, but the fear of being seen, truly seen, and called by his real name. The scar on Kaia's neck remained, but no one would ever embed a tracker in her again. Echo had learned to walk. His little tail wagged constantly, sometimes curling around Jonas's boots, sometimes nibbling gently at his mother's tail, sometimes dozing in the grass under the golden haze of afternoon sun. Jonas declined the offer to stay at the preservation center. He didn't like cities, couldn't sleep in soft beds, didn't trust walls painted white. "I live in a place where doors don't have to lock," he said, "and that place needs me now more than ever." Emily didn't stop him. She understood. The forest had never been just trees. For people like Jonas, it was a place to find themselves again. One step, one breath, one glance from a dog that once believed nothing could be trusted. That summer, the cabin at Raven Hollow was rebuilt, not to shield against storms, but to open another window, to let in more light. On the porch, Jonas hung a small wooden sign. The Silent Watcher, not to remember himself, but to remember her. Kaia, she never got her bark back, but she didn't need it. Her presence alone was enough to make forest creatures pause, enough to make children passing by squeal, "Mom, that dog's looking at me." And for Jonas, every morning, he opened his eyes to find Echo resting his head on his mother's paws. And Kaia lifted her gaze to meet his eyes that knew everything. That was enough. He no longer wrote in his journal every night. But one rainy afternoon, he picked up the old notebook and added a single line. "Some wounds never truly heal. But one day, someone will come, not with questions, not with answers, just quiet enough to lie beside you, until you're ready to open the door. And when you do, you don't just save them, you save yourself." The story ends in silence. Like Kaia herself, no grand conclusion, no sweeping scenery, just the soft patter of rain on a wooden roof, the whisper of wind through pine, and the sound of two sets of paws, one large, one small, chasing the last streaks of sunlight across the porch. Jonas stood at the doorway, tea in hand, eyes gently squinting, on a face that had long carried too much sorrow. There was one more wrinkle now, a smile.